there are really three causes of this new relationship between humanity and the Earth. First of all, population has been multiplied by 4 just in the last 100 years. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were only 1.6 billion people on the Earth, and now this year we are at 6.8 billion people. And that is projected to stabilize just above 9 billion people midway through this century. And it is actually a success story in slow motion that we're already beginning to see the slowing of population growth, and that the demographers can confidently project a stabilized population, albeit at much higher levels, by 2050. But even though it's a success story, we do have to continue putting emphasis on the creation of the conditions that lead to smaller family sizes. And we now know from the studies of the experts over the last few decades that there are 4 factors that must be emphasized in order to continue the trend towards stabilization. First of all, the education of girls. The education of girls is probably the single most important factor in helping to bring about the shift from large families to small families, and a new pattern with low birth rates and low death rates. The second factor that must continue receiving attention is the respect for and empowerment of women to enable them to participate fully in the decision-making in their communities and in their nations. The third factor is to continue to ensure the widespread availability of the means for fertility management so that women and their partners can make a choice about how many children to have and the spacing of their children. And these means for fertility management can be, of course, culturally appropriate and acceptable in country by country, but continuing to make sure that that is available is important. And the final of these 4 factors is, in the minds of many, the most important, and that is continuing to increase child survival rates by reducing child mortality. That gives parents the confidence that their children will survive. And that, in turn, unlocks the natural preference that most have for smaller families. And when all 4 of these conditions are present, population does continue to stabilize. Even though population is a slow-motion success story, it is, however, an important factor in explaining why this relationship between humanity and the planet is so very different in our generation than it was during the time of our grandparents and great-grandparents. It is a different world, and we must take into account the fact that so many more of us have a bigger impact on the ecosphere. The second of the 3 factors is actually much more important in explaining the new impact we have on the Earth's environment than is population. And that is the dramatic change brought about by the scientific and technological revolution. The fact is, the new technologies that are now widely available throughout the world and are spreading from the developed nations to the developing nations greatly magnify the power that each of us has to have an impact on the Earth. And these technologies, of course, bring many blessings, and they often improve the quality of life dramatically. But the time has come for us to fully take into account the unanticipated side effects of these powerful technologies. 151 years ago this year, the first oil well was drilled in my country, in the state of Pennsylvania. And when oil was added to coal as the 2 dominant sources of fuel for the Industrial Revolution, and both of them now remain the dominant sources of energy on our planet, we began to put enormous quantities of carbon dioxide waste into the atmosphere. And of course, CO2 is a naturally occurring element, and it's highly beneficial to have the right amount because it keeps temperatures at within a range that is conducive to human life and to the civilization that we have developed. But by dramatically increasing the concentrations of CO2, along with the concentrations of methane and the other four greenhouse gas pollutants, we have begun to trap a huge extra amount of heat from the sun and raise temperatures on the planet. 151 years ago, the same year that the first oil well was drilled, the great Irish scientist John Tyndall first discovered that CO2 does trap heat. And by trapping the infrared radiation that is normally sent back out into space from the Earth in a much higher fraction, that began to raise temperatures on the surface of the planet and in the atmosphere. An equal amount of heat has been stored up in the oceans, which cover the majority of the planet, and that heat is going to be slowly re-released into the atmosphere. And it's important to note that factor, because even though temperatures have gone up 1 degree already in the global averages, that second degree is already programmed into the system. And what that means is, if we continue this pattern, we could create the conditions for truly catastrophic effects before those effects begin to be manifested in ways that ring the alarm bells and bring us to a sense of urgency necessary to act. So the third factor that has led to this new relationship between human beings and the ecosystem of our planet is the most subtle but the most important, and that is our way of thinking about it. Because we cannot wait for the worst of the consequences to appear, because we have to begin acting to change our impact on the Earth's environment before those impacts arrive, we have to be able to rely not on the automatic responses that we are good at. We automatically respond to the kinds of threats that our ancient ancestors survived. We have to use our capacity for reasoning and our ability to communicate with one another, our ability to share a common understanding of what the scientists are telling us. And then on the basis of that shared understanding, we have to act, and we have to start acting now. Because the impacts of the climate crisis are already beginning to unfold, even though the most serious impacts still lie in our future.